November came in hard that year, and the storm that finally broke over Gannett Harbor did not bother to knock. It came up the south shore the way bad news always does, sideways and certain, and it drove the sea over the old government breakwater in gray sheets that smelled of salt and diesel and the end of things. No one was supposed to be out in it. The pup in the cracked fish tote at the foot of the breakwater was not supposed to last the night, and by every reasonable measure he should not have. He was 8 weeks old, soaked to the skin, a German shepherd no bigger than a loaf of bread, and somewhere under all that shivering he was still trying, against the wind and the cold and his own failing little body, to sing. If you have ever loved something the world threw away, stay with this one. Tell us in the comments what town you're watching from tonight. And if you believe broken things can still be mended, subscribe and walk the rest of this road with us. Wade Kessler heard him at 5:40 in the morning, and Wade Kessler was a man who by then mostly heard nothing at all. He was 54, an American by birth and a widower by circumstance, and he had washed up in this Nova Scotia fishing town the way driftwood washes up, without a plan because the tide put him there. 22 years he'd given the United States Navy, most of them as a SEAL, and the body that remembered all of it ached in the wet the way old fence wire remembers the post it was strung on. He had a square, weathered face, hair gone the color of beach stone, and eyes that were a flat gray blue and steady when anyone was looking, and entirely empty when no one was. He walked the breakwater every morning before the harbor woke, not for his health, though he told the doctor in Bridgewater that it was, but because the house behind him was too quiet, and the breakwater at least had the sea to fill the silence. The house had been Nadine's. That was the whole of why he was here. Nadine had grown up 3 streets back from the wharf, a Gannett Harbor girl, with a laugh you could hear across the cove. And the two of them had spent 20 years promising each other, this town, this house, this slow gray morning, for when the service was done. They had bought the salt box with the peeling green trim and made 100 plans for it. And then the cancer came up the same way the storms did, sideways and certain, and it took her in 11 months, and Wade had moved into all their plans alone. That had been 2 years ago. He still slept on his side of the bed, and under that grief, older and quieter, was Boone. Boone had been his dog once, long before Nadine got sick. A sable shepherd with a black mask and a working dog's terrible courage, his partner through 3 deployments and the only living thing Wade had ever fully trusted to read a room before he did. On a road that no longer needs a name, in a country Wade no longer let himself picture, Boone had broken from his heel and shoved 90 pounds of muscle into Wade's chest a half-second before the world went white. Wade came home. Boone came home in a flag-draped crate, and Wade had carried the dog's brass tag in his shirt pocket ever since, the way some men carry a saint. He had told Nadine once, late, in the dark, that he'd buried the wrong half of himself in 2 different countries. She'd held his hand and said nothing, because she'd always known the difference between a thing you fix and a thing you simply stay beside. So when the wind dropped for a single breath that November morning and Wade heard, under the slap of the waves, a sound that was not the sea. Thin and wavering and almost human, a small broken note rising and falling like someone humming to themselves in an empty church. He stopped on the wet stone and felt something he had not felt in 2 years. He felt summoned. It took him 11 minutes to find the tote, wedged between 2 granite blocks where the spring tide had shoved it, half full of rainwater and 1 drowning pup. The litter mates, he'd learn later, were already gone. This one had climbed onto the body of his strongest sister, and from there onto the rim of the tote, and from there had simply refused. When Wade's big scarred hands came down out of the dark, the pup did not flinch. He lifted his soaked head, looked at the man with eyes too gold and too old for his skull, and made the sound again. Low, cracked, deliberate, as though he had been calling and was only now being answered. "All right," Wade said, the first word he'd spoken aloud since Tuesday. "All right, I've got you." He carried the pup inside his jacket, against the old furnace of his chest, and he ran the truck too fast on the slick road to the clinic at the edge of town, and he hammered on the door until the lights came on. Dr. Marin Doucette had been the Gannett Harbor vet for 9 years, and she was the kind of maritimer who treated 4 in the morning as simply a less convenient part of the day. She was 36, lean and sharp-eyed, with her dark hair shoved up under a toque, and her sleeves already pushed back before she'd finished crossing the floor. She took one look at the bundle in Wade's coat and another, longer one at Wade himself, and decided in that moment she would not be losing either of them if she could help it. Heat lamps in the back. Move. She had the pup on the warming table in under a minute, IV fluids in him in 3, and her own breath held for most of the hour that followed. Hypothermic, dehydrated, lungs full of harbor, riddled with the kind of neglect that told a whole story without a single word. This was no accident of one storm. This was a litter dumped, the runts of somebody's cash crop thrown out with the November tide to save the cost of a needle. She knew the look. She'd been seeing it more all year. Wade stood against the wall with his arms folded and did not leave, and Marin noticed that too. Men like him, she thought, did not usually wait. They dropped the animal and the guilt at the door and drove away clean. This one had planted himself like a fence post and looked as though he'd grow roots through the linoleum before he'd go. At 6:20, the pup's heart steadied. At 6:30, he lifted his head off the towel, found Wade across the room with those impossible gold eyes and made the sound. Softer now, but unmistakable, a low 3-note croon that climbed and broke and climbed again. Marin laughed before she could stop herself. "Well, he's got opinions." "He's talking," Wade said. "He's a shepherd. They all think they're talking." But she was watching the pup the way you watch a card trick you can't figure out, because the little dog had stopped looking at her, stopped looking at the warm, safe lamp, and had turned that wavering song toward the only broken thing in the room, toward the big silent man by the wall, and would not stop until Wade, against every habit of 2 lockdown years, crossed the floor and let the pup press his soaked head into his palm. "You'll need to name him," Marin said quietly, "if you're keeping him." Wade hadn't decided he was keeping anything, but the pup chose that exact moment to let out a long, ragged, off-key note that wobbled up the scale and fell off the end of it, and something in Wade that had been clenched shut since a hospital room in Halifax came loose just enough to let out the first thing it found. "Banjo," he said. "Sounds like a banjo with a string gone." And that was how it began. The pup should have stayed a private thing, 1 man and 1 dog in a green salt box by the harbor. But Gannett Harbor was 900 people, and 4 streets, and a Tim Hortons that knew everyone's order, and a secret in a town like that has the lifespan of a snowflake on a wood stove. Banjo grew. The legs came first, the way they do, until he was all paddle feet and elbows, and then the coat came in thick and dark, and then the voice. The voice. He never barked the way other dogs barked. He grumbled, he muttered. He held long, indignant, wavering conversations with the kettle, the mail truck, the gulls, and most of all with Wade, who found himself, for the first time in 2 years, answering, out loud, in an empty house that was no longer quite so empty. What unsettled people, when they began to notice, was not the noise. It was the aim of it. Earl Tobin noticed first. Earl ran the hardware and feed at the top of the wharf, a 78-year-old widower with a permanent scowl and a heart he'd spent 6 decades pretending not to have. Earl had buried his own wife the spring before Nadine, and he handled grief the way he handled everything, by being rude about it. When Wade brought the pup in for a bag of kibble, Earl announced that he had no use for dogs, that dogs were a tax on a sensible man, and that this one in particular looked like it had been assembled in the dark. Then Banjo, 4 months old and barely to Wade's knee, walked the length of the store, sat down in front of Earl, looked up at the old man's hard face and began, low and slow and impossibly tender, to sing. He did not do it to anyone else in the store. There were 5 people in the store. He did it to Earl. Earl Tobin stood very still behind his counter, and his scowl did something it had not done in 18 months, and he turned away to fuss with a shelf that needed no fussing, and when he turned back his eyes were wet and furious about it. "Take your kibble," he said roughly, "on the house, and get that animal out of my store before he ruins my reputation." He started mailing chicken thighs to the salt box the following week. For the dog's morale, he said, strictly the dog's. Wade watched it happen and did not understand it. And then Marin explained the thing she'd been turning over since the night on the warming table. "He goes to the grief," she said. They were standing in her clinic parking lot in a cold drizzle, Banjo leaning his whole weight against Wade's leg the way he always did now. "Whoever's hurting worst in the room, he finds them. I've watched him do it 4 times. It's not a trick, Wade. I don't have a word for what it is." She paused. "He found you on a breakwater in a gale. Think about that." Wade thought about it. He thought about it the way he'd been trained to think about everything, looking for the seam, the lie, the angle. And he could not find one. The pup had a gift, and the gift had a direction, and the direction was always toward the wound. It was Verna Croft who tested it past all doubting. Verna was 81 and farmed 40 acres of stony ground out past Canning, up in the Annapolis Valley where the dikes hold back the Bay of Fundy, and the soil is the color of old blood. She'd raised her grandson Theo there for 2 years now, ever since the boy's parents proved unequal to the job and the courts agreed. Theo was 7. He had been a chattering, fearless, bright-eyed thing until the previous Remembrance Day, when his older brother Jesse, Verna's other grandson, the one she'd raised first, the one in the Canadian Armed Forces who sent Theo postcards from the base in Petawawa and called him Little Man, was killed in a training accident a month before he was due home. Theo had not spoken since the funeral. Not one word. The doctors in Kentville called it selective mutism brought on by trauma, and gave Verna a list of specialists in Halifax she could not afford to reach, and a wait list she would not live long enough to clear. Verna brought the boy to Gannett Harbor the week before Christmas because a friend had a cottage they could borrow cheap, and because she thought the sea might do for the child what the doctors couldn't. She did not know about the dog. No one had told her. They met on the wharf, the 4 of them, in the brittle cold of a December afternoon, Wade and Banjo coming up from the breakwater, Verna and the silent boy bundled against the wind. Verna nodded the way Maritimers nod, a whole conversation in a tilt of the chin. Theo stared at the ground, and Banjo, who had been pulling toward home and his supper, went still. Then he walked, very slowly, across the frozen boards to the boy and lay down at his feet and began to sing. It was not like the others. With Earl he had been tender, with Wade he had been stubborn. With this small frozen-shut child he was almost unbearably gentle, a low wandering croon with no edges on it, and he pressed his big dark head against Theo's snow boots and sang as though he had all the time God ever made and would spend every minute of it right there. Theo's chin came up. Verna's hand went to her mouth. The boy crouched down very slowly, the way you approach something that might startle, and put both small mittened hands into the dog's ruff and pressed his face down against the warm dark fur, and for a long minute the only sound on the whole frozen wharf was a half-string banjo of a dog singing to a broken-hearted child. Then Theo Croft, who had not made a sound in 13 months, opened his mouth against the dog's neck and whispered so quietly that only Verna and Wade and the wind could hear it, "Jess." Verna sat down hard on a lobster crate and wept into her gloves. Wade Kessler, who had not cried at his own wife's funeral, who had stood at attention through last post, with his jaw locked and his face like the breakwater, found his own eyes burning and let them, and Banjo just kept singing, because the work was not finished, because there was more grief in that small body than one song could carry, and the dog seemed to know it. That was the moment everything turned. That was also, though no one knew it yet, the moment the trouble started. Because 17-year-old Cody Pine had been filming the harbor for a school video assignment, and he caught all of it, and that night, not meaning any harm in the world, he put 31 seconds of a German shepherd singing a mute boy back into speech up on the internet. By New Year's it had been watched 11 million times. What came up the highway from the city was not a storm, but it moved like one. The clip went everywhere. Morning shows in Toronto and Vancouver, a breakfast program out of London, England, a man in Tokyo who set the dog's croon to music. Strangers drove to Gannett Harbor to stand outside the green salt box. The Tim Hortons sold out of everything by 10 o'clock for a week, and Wade Kessler, who had spent a career being precisely the kind of man no camera ever found, woke up one cold morning to discover that the one fragile good thing he had left was now the property of the entire world. The first knock came from Grayson Webb. Webb was an animal talent agent out of Toronto, expensive shoes and a warm handshake, and the unhurried confidence of a man who had never once doubted he'd get what he came for. He had a contract in a leather folder and a number in his mouth that made Wade's old kitchen feel very small. Banjo, Webb explained, was a phenomenon, a series, a line of plush toys, a book deal, ghost-written naturally. therapy dog branding, personal appearances. Webb used the word content the way some men use the word soul, and he was certain, absolutely certain, that a sensible man, a man with a leaky roof and a widower's pension and a furnace on its last winter, would see the wisdom in it. You'd never have to worry about money again, Webb said, looking around the threadbare kitchen with a kindness that was almost real. And the dog would be cared for, loved even, by millions. Wade looked at the number on the page for a long time. He thought about the roof. He thought about Nadine, who'd wanted to fix the roof. And then he looked down at Banjo, who was lying under the table with his chin on Wade's boot. And he thought about a small frozen boy whispering his dead brother's name into that dog's fur. And he understood, the way you understand a thing in your spine before your head catches up, that what Webb was offering was to take the one true thing this animal could do and turn it into a method, a product, a trick performed on command for people who would clap and move on. To take the song out of the dog and sell the noise. He's not for sale, Wade said. Webb smiled the way men like Webb smile when they've heard no before and have always eventually heard something else. Everyone has a roof, Mr. Kessler. I'll leave the folder. Think it over. But Webb was not the storm. Webb was only the wind that came before it. The storm arrived 4 days later in the form of a quiet, tired woman named Dana Forsyth, an inspector with the Nova Scotia SPCA, who stood on Wade's porch with a clipboard and an apology already in her eyes. The dumped litter, it turned out, had a paper trail. The whole sorry business led back to an unlicensed breeding operation outside New Germany that the SPCA had been building a cruelty case against for 2 years. In November, they'd finally moved in and seized 41 dogs in conditions that made the inspectors sick. Banjo, the one pup who'd survived the harbor, was part of that case. Legally, he was evidence. Legally, he had never been Wade's to keep. He was an unregistered animal connected to an active prosecution, and under the rules Forsyth was bound to enforce, he was to be surrendered into provincial custody, held with the other survivors, and disposed of. Placed, she said, but Wade heard the other word underneath it, by the court's direction once the case closed. Which could be months. Which, given his documented behavioral irregularities, that was the phrase in the file, irregularities, for the only beautiful thing the dog did, might mean a transfer to a city facility far from here, evaluated by strangers, adopted out anonymously, or if no one understood what he was, not adopted out at all. I'm sorry, Forsyth said, and she meant it. I've got until Friday, the orders signed. I came myself so it wouldn't be the constabulary. That's all I could do. Friday was 3 days off. Wade stood in his own doorway with the cold coming in around his boots, and felt the old familiar thing rise in him, the thing he'd been trained for, the cold, clear readiness that came before a hard night. He could run. He had the skills. He could be 3 provinces away by Thursday with a dog and a false trail and a clean conscience. He had done harder extractions than this. But a man on the run is a man with no home, and Banjo's whole purpose was homes. Earl's lonely store, Wade's empty house, a mute boy's frozen heart. You could not save the dog by stealing the very thing the dog existed to give. So Wade Kessler did the hardest thing of his life, which was to stay and fight in the open and ask for help. He started with Marin, who pulled every medical record, and wrote a letter to the court describing, in clinical language that shook anyway, what she had watched this animal do. He went to Earl, who closed the hardware store for the first weekday in 40 years, and drove to Bridgewater to bang on the door of a lawyer he'd known since school. Cody, mortified that the clip he'd posted had become the noose, started a new one. The boy on the wharf, the whispered name, the whole town's account of what the dog was for, and the same internet that had made Banjo a circus turned, almost overnight, into 40,000 letters to the provincial minister. And Verna Croft, 81 years old and out of money and nearly out of time, did the bravest thing of all. She wrote to the court and offered to take the dog. Not Wade. Verna saw the truth before Wade could say it out loud. The dog belonged where the wound was deepest. Theo had spoken 11 words now, all of them into Banjo's fur, and the boy's doctor in Kentville had written in his own careful hand that he had never, in 30 years of practice, seen a child reopen so fast, and that he could make no promise about what would happen to that small reopening heart if the dog were taken away. The hearing was held on the Thursday. in a cramped municipal room in Bridgewater that smelled of radiator dust and wet wool, and half of Gannett Harbor drove up to stand in the back of it. Wade had not planned to speak. Wade had not spoken in public about anything that mattered since a chaplain handed him a folded flag. But when the SPCA's case had been laid out, correct and merciless, and the adjudicator asked if anyone wished to address the disposition of the animal, Wade Kessler stood up, and the whole room went quiet, because some men carry a silence that the room can feel the weight of when it finally breaks. He did not talk about the law. He talked about Boone, the dog who'd died with his body between Wade and the white light, the dog whose brass tag he was, at that moment, holding in his closed fist down at his side. He talked about Nadine, and the side of the bed he still didn't sleep on, and the 2 years he'd spent being a ghost in his dead wife's town. He said that he had come to this country to die slowly in a quiet house, and that he had been doing a fair job of it, until a half-drowned German shepherd in a fish tote had looked up at him on the worst morning of the worst November of his life, and decided, for reasons Wade would never deserve to understand, that Wade was worth singing back from the dead. "You've got a file there that calls it a behavioral irregularity," Wade said, and his voice did not shake, and that was somehow worse. "I'd call it the only working miracle I've met in 54 years. There's a boy out past Canning who said his dead brother's name for the first time in over a year into that dog's neck. I've got the dog. I'd keep him till I died, gladly. But I'm not here to ask you for him. I'm here to ask you to let him go where he's needed more than I need him. Send him to the boy. That's all. Just don't put the song in a cage." The room was very quiet when he sat down. Earl Tobin, in the second row, was crying openly and not pretending otherwise for once in his life. The adjudicator was a practical woman who had heard a great many sad stories, and was not paid to be moved by them. But she had read Marin's letter, and the boy's doctor's letter, and 40,000 others, and she had watched, the night before, a 31-second clip of a child come back to life. She conferred with the SPCA, who, to their lasting credit, had never wanted this either, and on the Friday the order would have taken effect, she signed a different one. The animal known as Banjo to be released from provincial custody into the care of Verna Croft of Canning, Nova Scotia, under a supervised arrangement, with Dr. Marin Doucette as veterinarian of record, for purposes the order, in a phrase that made the whole back row of the room exhale at once, described as demonstrated therapeutic benefit to a minor in the household. He would not be famous. He would not be a series, or a plush toy, or a brand. Grayson Webb drove back to Toronto with his leather folder unsigned and, somewhere under the disappointment, the faint discomfort of a man who has been shown a thing he can't buy and isn't sure how to feel about it. Banjo would just be a boy's dog on a stony farm, doing the only thing he had ever wanted to do. Wade drove him to Canning himself, the week before spring, on a morning when the last snow lay gray and softening over the valley, and the dikes ran black with meltwater toward the bay. He had not slept. He had spent the night on the floor beside the dog, the way he'd spent that first night in the clinic, his hand in the thick dark rough, because he had finally let himself love something again, and now he had to give it away, and he had learned long ago that the giving away is the part that costs. Verna's farmhouse sat at the end of a long muddy lane, white clapboard gone soft at the edges, a porch that sagged like a tired shoulder. Theo was waiting on the step before the truck had stopped. He had grown an inch over the winter. He had a red ball in his hand and a look on his face that Wade would carry to his own grave. And when Wade opened the truck door, Banjo did not hesitate, did not look back, did not give Wade the small mercy of a moment's grief. He poured himself out of the cab and across the muddy yard and hit the boy at a dead run, and the two of them went down in the slush in a tangle of legs and laughing. And that wonderful ragged off-key song. And Theo Croft laughed out loud, a real laugh, a whole one, the first the farm had heard since the postcards from Petawawa stopped coming. Wade stood by the truck and let them have it. Then he walked to the fence post at the head of the lane, where Verna had nailed up a hand-painted board the night before. Banjo's place, in a child's careful, oversized letters, because Theo had insisted on doing the lettering himself, the first writing he'd done in a year. And Wade Kessler reached under his collar and unhooked the brass tag he had carried in his shirt for over a decade, the tag that said Boone and a service number, and nothing else, the last hard weight of the last dog who'd ever loved him, and he fastened it to the bottom corner of the sign where it caught the thin spring light. There, he said, to no one, to both of them, to the whole long line of dogs and men and grief that had brought him to a muddy lane in the Annapolis Valley. You're home now, both of you. Go on. He did not say goodbye to the pup. Some farewells, he'd come to understand, are not goodbyes at all. They're just the moment the gift finally finishes leaving your hands. The valley did for them what no specialist in Halifax could have. By summer, Theo was speaking in full sentences again, fast and bright and full of questions, the chatter Verna had thought she'd buried with her older grandson. By fall, the boy was back in school, and Banjo walked him to the end of the lane every morning and grumbled the whole way home about it. Verna started letting others come, a widower from down the road who arrived with treats in his coat pocket and the excuse of a fence to fix, a girl from Theo's class who'd lost her mother, a gray-faced veteran from the Legion in Kentville who drove 40 kilometers and said he'd only come for the drive, and who left 2 hours later, having said more than he'd said in 3 years, because a German shepherd had found him across a crowded kitchen and sung to the exact place where the war still lived. Earl Tobin mailed chicken thighs to Canning now instead of Gannett Harbor, and a cedar plaque he'd cut and sanded himself, the letters burnt in uneven but deep. Kindness is still a postic. Marin made the drive a monthly and pretended it was professional, and Wade Kessler, who had come to a quiet town to die slowly, found that the dying had somehow stopped without his noticing the day it happened. He fixed the roof in July. He slept, by August, in the middle of the bed. He started showing up at the Legion on Friday nights, and then on the in-between nights too, and he learned that the silence he'd carried for 2 years was not, it turned out, a thing you had to carry alone. A year to the week after the storm, Wade drove out to Canning on the first hard snow of the new November. He went in the old way, the way he'd never quite stopped being, collar up, jaw set, but he went, and that was the whole of the difference. Theo met him at the gate, taller again, talking before Wade was out of the truck, and Verna stood on the porch, with her cheeks gone pink in the cold, looking not like a woman who'd been healed of her grief, but like a woman who'd finally found company to carry it, which is the most that any of us are promised, and more than most of us get. In the white field beyond the barn, Theo threw the red ball, and a strong young German shepherd, with a deep sable coat and powerful legs, and the same ragged half-string voice tore through the new snow after it. No longer the half-drowned scrap from the breakwater, but the same soul in a bigger body, the same gold eyes, the same unbearable tenderness. From the town below, the church bell began to ring the noon hour. Banjo stopped dead in the snow, lifted his great dark head, and sang. Not to gunfire, not to grief now, but to the bells, to the snow, to a boy's laughter and a grandmother's mended quiet, and a gray-haired man standing at a fence in the cold with his eyes full and his ch-ch, at long last, not empty. Wade walked to the sign. Boone's tag was still there, dark now with a year of weather, hanging beneath a boy's proud crooked letters. He touched it once, the brass cold under his thumb, and he was no longer sure, and no longer needed to be, whether the dog who'd brought him home was the one buried half a world away, or the one singing in the snow, or whether in the end they had been the same long act of mercy all along. You brought me home too, you know, he said quietly. Both of you. Banjo heard him, he always heard him, and broke from the boy and came bounding across the white field, and pressed his whole warm weight against Wade's legs the way he had since the night on the warming table, and let out one bright off-key, joyful note that made Theo laugh and Verna wipe her eyes and Wade Kessler, 55 now and no longer a ghost, finally fully smile. Some skews, it turns out, run in both directions. Sometimes the thing you pull out of the cold storm is the thing that pulls you out of yours. And you spend years thinking you saved a dog when the truth, the whole quiet, impossible truth of it, was that a half-drowned puppy in a fish tote looked up at a dying man one November morning and decided he was worth singing for. None of us will likely find a shepherd in the harbor, but there is always someone near us going under quietly, in a store or a kitchen or a Friday night Legion, waiting for one person to cross the room and sing to the broken place. A phone call, a casserole, a poppy worn straight. A little patience kept past the point it's easy. That can be the whole miracle, for somebody. That can be enough. If this one found the soft place in you tonight, Stay a moment longer. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and the name of the one you've lost and still love, and we'll read every single one. Share it with someone who's gone quiet lately, and subscribe and walk the next road with us. There's always another one out there in the cold, still trying, against all sense, to sing.